In this video, we will learn vocabulary on the topic of treaty actions. So let's get started. This glossary is intended as a general guide and is not presumed to be exhaustive. Acceptance and approval. The instruments of acceptance or approval of a treaty have the same legal effect as ratification and consequently express the consent of a state to be bound by a treaty. In the practice of certain states, acceptance and approval have been used instead of ratification when, at a national level, constitutional law does not require the treaty to be ratified by the head of state. Accession. Accession is the act whereby a state accepts the offer or the opportunity to become a party to a treaty already negotiated and signed by other states. It has the same legal effect as ratification. Adoption. Adoption is the formal act by which the form and content of a proposed treaty text are established. As a general rule, the adoption of the text of a treaty takes place through the expression of the consent of the states participating in the treaty-making process. Amendment. The term amendment refers to the formal alteration of treaty provisions affecting all the parties to the particular agreement. Authentication. The term authentication refers to the procedure whereby the text of a treaty is established as authentic and definitive. Once a treaty has been authenticated, states cannot unilaterally change its provisions. Correction of errors. If, after the authentication of a text, the signatory and contracting states are agreed that it contains an error, it can be corrected by initialing the corrected treaty text, by executing or exchanging an instrument containing the correction, or by executing the corrected text of the whole treaty by the same procedure as in the case of the original text. Declarations. Sometimes states make declarations as to their understanding of some matter or as to the interpretation of a particular provision. Unlike reservations, declarations merely clarify the state's position and do not purport to exclude or modify the legal effect of a treaty. Entry into force. Typically, the provisions of the treaty determine the date on which the treaty enters into force. Where the treaty does not specify a date, there is a presumption that the treaty is intended to come into force as soon as all the negotiating states have consented to be bound by the treaty. Full powers. Full powers means a document emanating from the competent authority of a state designating a person or persons to represent the state for negotiating, adopting, authenticating the text of a treaty, expressing the consent of a state to be bound by a treaty, or for accomplishing any other act with respect to that treaty. Modification. The term modification refers to the variation of certain treaty provisions only as between particular parties of a treaty. While in their relation to the other parties the original treaty provisions remain applicable. If the treaty is silent on modifications, they are allowed only if the modifications do not affect the rights or obligations of the other parties to the treaty and do not contravene the object and the purpose of the treaty. Notification. The term notification refers to a formality through which a state or an international organization communicates certain facts or events of legal importance. Objection. Any signatory or contracting state has the option of objecting to a reservation, inter alia, if, in its opinion, the reservation is incompatible with the object and purpose of the treaty. The objecting state may further declare that its objection has the effect of precluding the entry into force of the treaty as between objecting and reserving states. Ratification. Ratification defines the international act whereby a state indicates its consent to be bound to a treaty if the parties intended to show their consent by such an act. In the case of bilateral treaties, ratification is usually accomplished by exchanging the requisite instruments. While in the case of multilateral treaties the usual procedure is for the depositary to collect the ratifications of all states, keeping all parties informed of the situation. Reservation. A reservation is a declaration made by a state by which it purports to exclude or alter the legal effect of certain provisions of the treaty in their application to that state. A reservation enables a state to accept a multilateral treaty as a whole by giving it the possibility not to apply certain provisions with which it does not want to comply. Reservations can be made when the treaty is signed, ratified, accepted, approved or acceded to. Revision. Revision has basically the same meaning as amendment. However, some treaties provide for a revision additional to an amendment, i.e., Article 109 of the Charter of the United Nations. In that case, the term revision refers to an overriding adoption of the treaty to changed circumstances, whereas the term amendment refers only to a change of singular provisions. Signature ad referendum. A representative may sign a treaty ad referendum, i.e., under the condition that the signature is confirmed by his state. In this case, the signature becomes definitive once it is confirmed by the responsible organ. Covenant. Binding agreement between states, used synonymously with convention and treaty. The major international human rights covenants, both passed in 1966, are the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. Customary international law. Law that becomes binding on states although it is not written, but rather adhered to out of custom. When enough states have begun to behave as though something is law, it becomes law by use. This is one of the main sources of international law.